The flames consumed the stable barn on Robert Thornton's Virginia estate with such ferocity that neighbors 3 miles away saw the orange glow against the October sky. When the fire finally burned itself out at dawn, searchers found their master's body near the barn's rear door, a door that appeared to have been barred from the outside, trapping him inside while the building became an inferno. Joshua Reed, the enslaved stablemaster who had tended the Thornton horses for 20 years, reported discovering the fire too late to save his master, though he had managed to rescue all 12 valuable horses from their stalls. The story was believed because everyone knew Joshua's devotion to those animals, and because barn fires were common enough in 1842 Virginia. What they didn't know was that Joshua had spent 6 weeks planning every detail of that fire, waiting for the perfect night when his master would be alone in the stable, drunk enough to be slow, but conscious enough to understand exactly why he was going to die. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 6 weeks before the fire, Joshua had been working late in the stable, cleaning tack and preparing feed for the morning, when he heard his daughter Hannah's voice calling his name with an urgency that sent ice through his veins. She had stumbled into the barn, her dress torn at the shoulder, her face streaked with tears, her eyes holding a devastation that no 15-year-old should ever know. Master Thornton had cornered her in the hayloft earlier that evening, using his authority and physical strength to commit an act that would haunt Joshua for the rest of his life. Hannah's sobs, as she collapsed into her father's arms, created something inside him that transcended rage, a cold, calculating determination that this violation would not go unanswered, regardless of the consequences. Joshua held his daughter while his mind began working through possibilities, understanding that any direct confrontation would result in his own death and potentially worse punishment for Hannah. But the barn around them, the structure he knew more intimately than any other place on earth, whispered solutions that involved neither confrontation nor evidence that could lead back to deliberate action. The year was 1842, and the Thornton plantation occupied 800 acres of prime Virginia horse country, rolling hills covered with bluegrass that provided ideal grazing for the breeding stock that had made the Thornton name synonymous with quality throughout the region. The main house stood on a rise overlooking pastures where mares and their foals grazed during warmer months, a 2-story brick structure that spoke to the family's wealth and social standing. Behind the main house, separated by perhaps 200 yards, stood the stable barn Joshua's domain for the past 20 years. The barn was an impressive structure, 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, built from oak timbers that had been carefully selected for strength and durability. The main level housed 12 box stalls, each large enough to accommodate the plantation's valuable horses comfortably, with a central aisle wide enough to allow easy movement of equipment and animals. Above the stalls, a hayloft ran the building's entire length, capable of storing months of feed and bedding materials. The barn's design reflected the elder Thornton's commitment to maintaining horses in conditions that would maximize their health and breeding potential, though that same attention to animal welfare had never extended to concern for the human beings who cared for those animals. Joshua Reed had been born on the Thornton plantation in 1802, the son of a field worker named Samuel and a woman named Grace, who had died when Joshua was too young to remember her face. From earliest childhood, Joshua had shown an affinity for horses that impressed even the plantation's white overseers. By age 10, he was working in the stable under the supervision of an elderly enslaved man named Tobias, who taught him not just how to care for horses, but how to understand them in ways that seemed almost supernatural to people who didn't possess the gift. Tobias had been born in Africa, brought to Virginia as a young man, and he carried with him knowledge about horses that predated the European traditions most plantation owners followed. He taught Joshua to read equine body language, to recognize signs of illness or distress before they became obvious, to anticipate what a horse needed sometimes, before the animal itself seemed to know. That education had been conducted in whispers during the rare moments when white overseers weren't present, because Tobias understood that enslaved people who displayed too much intelligence or capability often found themselves resented by masters who preferred their property to remain ignorant and dependent. When Tobias died in 1822, 20-year-old Joshua had assumed responsibility for the stable with skills that exceeded those of many white horse trainers who charged substantial fees for their expertise. The elder Thornton, Robert's father, had recognized Joshua's value and had granted him unusual privileges as a result. Joshua was allowed to live in a small cabin near the stable rather than in the communal slave quarters. He was given better food rations than field workers received, understanding that maintaining the horses required strength and energy that inadequate nutrition would undermine. And most importantly, he was trusted with significant autonomy in managing the stable's daily operations, making decisions about breeding, training, and care that would normally have required white supervision. That trust had its limits, of course. Joshua remained property, subject to sale or punishment at his master's whim, unable to own anything or protect anyone he loved from the system's casual cruelties. But within the narrow confines of the stable, he possessed something that resembled authority, and he had used that authority to create a world where the horses under his care thrived, and where he could maintain some small measure of dignity despite his enslaved status. Joshua had married in 1825, choosing a woman named Rebecca, who worked as a seamstress in the main house. Their wedding had been a simple ceremony, conducted by the enslaved preacher who served the plantation's black community, followed by permission from Master Thornton to share Joshua's cabin near the stable. Rebecca had given birth to 3 children over the following years, 2 sons who had been sold away when the elder Thornton needed cash to expand his breeding operation, and a daughter named Hannah who had been born in 1827 and who had somehow escaped sale through a combination of luck and her mother's value as a skilled seamstress. Hannah had grown up in and around the stable, helping her father with small tasks from the time she could walk, developing her own connection to the horses that seemed to run in the family. She had her father's gentle way with animals and her mother's quick intelligence, though both parents understood that intelligence was dangerous for enslaved girls to display too openly. They had taught Hannah to be careful, to keep her head down, to avoid drawing attention that might lead to the kind of notice that could destroy young black women in a system that viewed them as property available for any use their owners might desire. Despite their careful protection, despite Joshua's trusted position and Rebecca's value to the household, Hannah had caught Master Robert Thornton's attention in ways that filled her parents with dread they could never express openly. Robert had inherited the plantation when his father died in 1838, and with it came both the property's assets and its darker traditions. Unlike his father, who had maintained at least superficial respect for the enslaved families under his control, Robert viewed his human property with casual entitlement that made him dangerous in ways the elder Thornton had never been. Robert Thornton was 35 years old in 1842, married to a woman named Catherine, who spent most of her time in Richmond visiting family and avoiding the isolation of plantation life. Their marriage had produced no children, a fact that seemed to increase Robert's drinking and his nocturnal wanderings through the estate. He had developed the habit of visiting the stable late at night, ostensibly to check on horses or to find solitude away from the empty main house. But increasingly those visits coincided with times when Hannah might be present helping her father with evening chores. Joshua had noticed this pattern developing over the 6 months before the assault, had felt growing unease each time Thornton appeared at the stable door after dark. He had tried to shield Hannah by sending her back to the cabin earlier in the evenings, by ensuring she was never alone when the master might arrive. But his vigilance had failed on the September night, when Rebecca had needed Hannah's help with an urgent sewing project in the main house. Hannah had finished that work and stopped by the stable to say goodnight to her father before returning to their cabin, a routine visit that should have been safe and brief. Instead, she had encountered Robert Thornton in the hayloft, where he had gone supposedly to inspect stored feed, but where he had actually been waiting, drinking from a flask, and working up courage for the violation he had been contemplating for months. What happened in that loft during the 20 minutes before Hannah escaped would remain largely unspoken between father and daughter, the details too painful for Hannah to fully articulate and too devastating for Joshua to request. What mattered was the fact itself, that Thornton had committed an act that shattered whatever illusions Joshua had maintained about his ability to protect the people he loved within a system designed to make such protection impossible. The night Hannah came to him crying, Joshua made decisions that would determine the rest of his life. He could report Thornton's assault to white authorities, but that path led nowhere. Enslaved women had no legal standing to accuse white men of sexual crimes, and any attempt to seek justice through official channels would likely result in punishment for the accuser rather than the perpetrator. He could attempt to physically confront Thornton, but that would mean certain death for Joshua, and potentially worse consequences for Hannah and Rebecca. He could try to run, but escape from Virginia with a wife and teenage daughter while being pursued by men with dogs and guns offered minimal chance of success. Or he could plan something that would look like accident, that would remove Thornton from the world, without creating evidence that pointed toward deliberate action. The stable barn that had been Joshua's life's work could become Robert Thornton's tomb, if Joshua was willing to sacrifice 20 years of labor and accept whatever consequences followed. The decision crystallized quickly. His daughter's safety and dignity mattered more than any building, and a man who would commit such violation deserved whatever fate Joshua could engineer. The planning began immediately, conducted in the quiet hours when Joshua worked alone in the stable, his hands performing familiar tasks, while his mind catalogued every detail of the barn's construction and every element of Thornton's patterns. Joshua knew the building's weaknesses intimately, places where support beams had developed small cracks over the years, sections where moisture had created rot that he had been meaning to repair, joints where the original construction had been slightly substandard. He knew which materials burned hottest and fastest, where airflow would feed flames most efficiently, how long it would take fire to spread from initial ignition to complete engulfment. Most importantly, Joshua understood Robert Thornton's habits well enough to predict when the master would be in the barn alone, drunk, and vulnerable. Thornton visited the stable 3 or 4 times per week after dark, always between 10 o'clock and midnight, always after consuming substantial quantities of whiskey. He would spend 30 to 45 minutes wandering through the stalls, sometimes talking to the horses in slurred rambling that suggested he found their company preferable to human interaction. Those visits followed a pattern consistent enough that Joshua could plan around them with reasonable confidence. Over the following 6 weeks, Joshua began subtle preparations disguised as normal maintenance and negligence. He moved bales of hay to positions where they would feed fire most effectively once ignited, arranging them in patterns that looked random, but that created pathways for flames to follow. He identified the barn's rear door, a heavy wooden structure that opened outward, and was secured by a crossbar that dropped into iron brackets mounted on the exterior wall. That door had always been difficult to operate, requiring force to overcome warped wood that had never been properly planned, and Joshua ensured it became even more stubborn by deliberately allowing moisture to swell the frame further. He also began weakening certain support structures in ways that wouldn't be obvious until fire created stress that exposed the damage. A critical beam near the hayloft received careful applications of water that encouraged rot in places where it wouldn't show. Joints in the roof framing were subtly loosened, creating instability that normal conditions wouldn't reveal, but that heat and flame would exploit catastrophically. Joshua worked on these sabotages during his normal maintenance hours, making the changes appear to be either existing problems he hadn't yet addressed, or the natural deterioration that affected all wooden buildings over time. The horses remained his primary concern throughout this preparation period. Joshua would not allow innocent animals to suffer for his need for justice against their master. He developed a detailed plan for how to evacuate all 12 horses quickly once fire started, memorizing which stalls to open first, which animals would need extra encouragement to leave the burning building, how to prevent panic that might cause injury during the evacuation. He practiced elements of this plan during normal evening routines, training the horses to respond to his voice commands, even in potentially chaotic situations. He worked with each horse individually, reinforcing their trust in him and their willingness to follow his direction even when frightened. The mare in the first stall, a high-strung thoroughbred named Lady, required extra attention because she tended toward panic in unusual situations. Joshua spent additional time with her, teaching her to respond to his voice regardless of external chaos. The gelding in the fourth stall, a calm, older horse named Duke, would serve as a stabilizing influence on the others, and Joshua positioned him strategically so that evacuating him early would help calm the remaining animals. Hannah remained mostly unaware of her father's planning, though she understood something had changed in him since that terrible night. Joshua had become quieter, more contemplative, spending long hours staring at the barn's structure as if seeing it for the first time. Rebecca knew her husband well enough to recognize that he was working through some significant decision, though she didn't press him for details, understanding that some burdens were too dangerous to share even between married people who trusted each other completely. As the 6 weeks progressed, Joshua refined his plan with obsessive attention to detail. He identified October 15th as the ideal date based on Thornton's patterns and the fact that Catherine Thornton would be away visiting family in Richmond that week, eliminating one potential complication. He prepared explanations for how he discovered the fire, for why he couldn't reach his trapped master despite heroic efforts, for why all the horses survived while the building's owner did not. The date approached with agonizing slowness, each day requiring Joshua to maintain his usual demeanor of calm competence while internally reviewing every element of his plan for potential flaws. He interacted with Robert Thornton during those weeks with careful neutrality, accepting orders and responding to questions with the practiced deference that had kept him safe for 2 decades. Thornton seemed entirely oblivious to any change in Joshua's behavior, viewing his stable master with the same casual assumption of loyalty that characterized how most plantation owners regarded their enslaved workers. On the morning of October 15th, Joshua rose before dawn as he always did, and began his normal routine of feeding the horses and mucking out stalls. The physical labor helped calm the nervousness that threatened to break through his carefully maintained exterior. He had committed himself to this course of action weeks earlier, but the reality of what he planned to do that night created anxiety that manifested in subtle tremors in his hands and a tightness in his chest that made breathing feel labored. Rebecca noticed her husband's tension over breakfast, reaching across their small table to squeeze his hand in silent support for struggles she didn't fully understand, but recognized as significant. Hannah ate quietly, her own trauma from 6 weeks earlier still evident in the way she startled at sudden sounds and avoided looking toward the main house where Thornton lived. The sight of his daughter's ongoing distress reinforced Joshua's determination, reminding him why he was willing to risk everything for justice that would never come through legitimate channels. The day passed with excruciating slowness, each hour feeling like several as Joshua performed his normal duties while mentally rehearsing the evening's plan. He checked and rechecked the positions of hay bales that would feed the fire, verified that the rear door's crossbar was positioned exactly where he needed it, and spent extra time with each horse, speaking to them in low tones that conveyed both affection and preparation for what was coming. The animals sensed something different in his manner, several of them displaying restlessness that Joshua worked to soothe while not entirely eliminating, understanding that a degree of alertness would help them respond quickly when evacuation became necessary. Catherine Thornton had departed for Richmond 3 days earlier, leaving her husband alone in the main house with only minimal house staff for company. Joshua had observed Robert's behavior during his wife's absence and had noted the increased drinking and the earlier starts to his nocturnal wanderings. These patterns suggested that Thornton would likely visit the stable that evening, probably between 10 and 11 o'clock, which would provide ideal timing for Joshua's purposes. As sunset approached, Joshua sent Hannah and Rebecca back to their cabin with instructions to remain inside, regardless of what they might hear or see later that evening. Rebecca's eyes held questions she didn't voice, but she nodded understanding and guided Hannah away from the stable area. Joshua watched them go, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability to consider that this might be the last normal evening his family would ever experience. If his plan failed, if any detail went wrong, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for the two people he loved most in the world. Darkness fell across the plantation around 7 o'clock, and Joshua lit the lanterns that illuminated the stable's interior while leaving strategic areas in shadow. He positioned himself in the tack room, ostensibly organizing equipment, but actually watching through a small window that provided clear view of the path from the main house. From this vantage point, he could see Thornton approaching while remaining invisible himself, giving him time to prepare for the final sequence of actions that would transform plan into reality. The wait felt endless, each minute expanding like heated metal as Joshua maintained his vigil. Other enslaved workers finished their evening duties and retired to the quarters, leaving the area around the stable increasingly quiet and isolated. The horses shifted in their stalls, some dozing, while others remained alert to the unusual tension their caretaker was projecting, despite his attempts to appear calm. At 10:30, Joshua saw movement near the main house, a figure emerging from the back door and walking with the unsteady gait that characterized Robert Thornton after substantial drinking. The master carried a lantern that swung erratically as he navigated the path toward the stable, its light creating moving shadows that would have been comical if the situation weren't so deadly serious. Joshua moved quickly but quietly from the tack room to the main aisle, positioning himself near the front entrance while remaining out of immediate view. Thornton entered the stable without acknowledging Joshua's presence, which wasn't unusual given how drunk he appeared to be. The master walked down the center aisle, stopping occasionally to peer into stalls and mutter comments to horses who ignored him with the patient tolerance animals developed toward humans whose behavior makes no sense. Joshua watched from the shadows, timing his next actions based on Thornton's position and movement patterns. When Thornton reached the stable's far end and began climbing the ladder to the hayloft, a journey he made occasionally when particularly drunk, sitting among the stored hay as if elevation provided perspective his life otherwise lacked, Joshua moved with swift precision toward the rear door. The heavy wooden crossbar that secured this exit from outside was designed to prevent horses from escaping if stall doors failed, but tonight it would serve a very different purpose. Joshua waited until he heard Thornton's footsteps on the hayloft floor above, confirming that the master had completed his climb and was now in the building's most isolated section. Then Joshua moved to the rear entrance, opened the door briefly to verify it functioned as planned, and positioned the wooden crossbar within easy reach just outside the doorframe. Everything was ready except for the fire itself, and that would come soon enough once Thornton attempted to leave and discovered that the building had become his prison. Joshua returned to the front of the barn and began his planned evacuation of the horses, starting with Lady in the first stall. The mare responded to his voice commands despite her natural skittishness, allowing him to guide her quickly through the front entrance and into the paddock beyond. He repeated this process with systematic efficiency, opening each stall door in the sequence he had practiced mentally for weeks, speaking calmly to each animal, even as his heart raced with the knowledge of what was unfolding. By the time Joshua had evacuated the 8th horse, he heard Thornton moving in the hayloft above, apparently preparing to descend and leave the barn. Joshua worked faster, opening the remaining stalls and encouraging horses toward the exit with increasing urgency. The animals sensed something wrong now, their natural prey instincts responding to the tension radiating from their caretaker, despite his attempts to project calm. The final 4 horses evacuated in rapid succession, their hooves clattering against the wooden floor as they surged toward the paddock, where their stablemates waited in confused grouping. Joshua counted quickly, verifying that all 12 animals were safely outside before turning his attention to the building's rear section, where Robert Thornton would soon attempt his exit. The master's footsteps on the hayloft ladder confirmed he was descending, likely intending to return to the main house and whatever bottle of whiskey awaited him there. Joshua moved with practiced speed to the rear door, reaching it just as Thornton's boots hit the ground floor. The master walked toward the back exit with the determined focus of a drunk man following familiar routine, apparently intending to use this door rather than walking the barn's full length to the front entrance he had used when arriving. Joshua positioned himself in shadows near the door, his hand on the heavy crossbar he had prepared, waiting for the precise moment when Thornton would be close enough to the exit that escape would seem possible, but far enough inside that the door closing would trap him completely. Thornton reached for the door's interior handle, pulling it open with the force necessary to overcome the warped frame Joshua had deliberately worsened over the past weeks. The door swung outward into the night, and Thornton stepped into the threshold, 1 foot outside and 1 still within the barn. At that exact moment, Joshua moved with explosive speed, slamming the door closed with enough force to knock Thornton backward into the barn's interior. Before the master could recover his balance or understand what was happening, Joshua dropped the heavy wooden crossbar into its exterior brackets, securing the door in a way that would require superhuman strength to break through from inside. Thornton's shout of confusion transformed quickly into anger as he understood he had been deliberately trapped. He pounded on the door with fists that would leave bruises, but would never break through oak planks 3 inches thick. "Joshua, open this door immediately! This is your master speaking." The command carried all the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience, but that authority meant nothing now. For the first time in Robert Thornton's life, he was powerless before someone he had always controlled completely. Joshua didn't respond to the shouting. Instead, he moved quickly to where he had prepared materials for the fire, a pile of oil-soaked rags positioned near hay bales that would ignite rapidly once flame touched them. He had planned this part carefully, understanding that the fire needed to spread fast enough to prevent escape, but not so explosively that it endangered the evacuated horses or drew attention before Thornton could be consumed by flames. Joshua struck a match and touched it to the oil-soaked material, watching as fire caught immediately, and began spreading along the paths he had created through strategic positioning of combustible materials. The flames climbed with satisfying speed, following Joshua's careful architecture of destruction. Within seconds, multiple points of ignition had created a growing inferno that spread toward the hayloft, where stored feed would provide abundant fuel. Joshua backed away from the heat, moving toward the front entrance while keeping his eyes on the growing fire to ensure it developed as planned. Smoke began filling the barn's upper regions, creating a dark cloud that would soon make breathing difficult for anyone trapped inside. Thornton's shouting had transformed from anger to panic as he understood the fire's reality. The rear door remained immovable despite his desperate attempts to break through, and smoke was already making its way to his section of the barn. He stumbled through the smoke toward the main aisle, seeking the front entrance Joshua had used to evacuate the horses, but the fire had spread across that route with the speed Joshua had engineered through weeks of preparation. Flames climbed the walls and support beams, feeding on the weakened structures Joshua had sabotaged to ensure they would burn quickly. Joshua stood in the paddock with the 12 rescued horses, watching the barn that had been his life's work transform into an inferno that would consume his daughter's abuser. The flames were visible through windows and gaps in the structure, creating an orange glow that grew brighter as the fire reached the hayloft and found the massive quantities of stored feed waiting there. The sound of the fire was almost a live crackling, roaring, punctuated by the crashes of falling timbers as weakened supports finally failed under the heat's stress. Thornton's screams were audible for several minutes, growing more desperate and then weaker as smoke overcame him, before the flames could reach his location. Joshua felt no satisfaction in those sounds, only a grim recognition that justice, however imperfect and however achieved, was being served. The man who had violated Hannah, who had believed his ownership of human beings gave him unlimited power over their bodies and lives, was learning in his final moments that some actions carried consequences even in a system designed to protect men like him from accountability. The fire reached its peak intensity perhaps 20 minutes after Joshua had ignited it, the entire barn now fully engulfed in flames that climbed 50 feet into the October sky. The heat was intense enough that Joshua had to move the horses further away, guiding them to a distant paddock where they would be safe from both flames and falling debris. By the time he had secured all the animals in their temporary location, he could see lights appearing in windows at the main house and in the slave quarters as people woke to the fire's glow and began responding to the emergency. Joshua ran toward the main house, shouting about the fire with exactly the level of panic appropriate for someone who had just discovered his workplace burning with his master potentially trapped inside. House servants emerged in nightclothes, their faces reflecting shock and horror as they saw the stable's complete engulfment. Several enslaved men grabbed buckets and began running toward the fire, though Joshua knew their efforts would be futile given how thoroughly the building was now consumed. "Master Thornton was in the barn," Joshua shouted to anyone who would listen. "I got all the horses out, but I couldn't reach him. The fire spread too fast." The story was exactly as he had rehearsed it, delivered with the breathless urgency of a man who had genuinely tried and failed to save his master's life. Several people tried to approach the burning barn, but the heat drove them back, forcing them to watch helplessly as the structure collapsed inward with a roar of falling timbers and exploding sparks. The white overseer who managed the plantation's field operations arrived within minutes, having been awakened by the commotion and the unnatural brightness visible from his cottage a quarter-mile distant. Thomas Fletcher was a hard man who ruled the enslaved workers with calculated cruelty, but even he seemed shaken by the inferno, consuming what had been the plantation's most valuable building outside the main house itself. He grabbed Joshua by the shoulders, his face illuminated by the fire's orange glow, and demanded an accounting of what had happened. Joshua delivered his prepared explanation with exactly the right combination of distress and confusion. He had been finishing evening chores when he smelled smoke and discovered fire already spreading through the barn's interior. He had immediately begun evacuating the horses, working as quickly as possible to get all 12 animals to safety. Only after securing the last horse had he realized that Master Thornton must have been in the barn, probably in the hayloft, where he sometimes went during evening visits. Joshua had attempted to enter the burning building to search for his master, but the flames and smoke had been too intense, driving him back before he could reach the rear section where Thornton might have been trapped. The story was plausible because it contained elements of truth woven through the lies. The horses had indeed been evacuated with impressive speed, a fact verified by their presence in the paddock where they stood watching the fire with nervous agitation. The fire had indeed spread with remarkable speed, consistent with barn fires that found abundant fuel in stored hay and dry wooden structures, and Joshua's apparent distress about failing to save his master seemed entirely genuine to people who didn't understand that his anguish was actually relief, mixed with the delayed shock of having committed an act from which there could be no return. More people arrived as word of the fire spread through the plantation and to neighboring estates. White men on horseback came to offer assistance, though there was nothing to be done except watch the barn burn itself out and prevent the fire from spreading to other structures. The main house was far enough away that it faced no immediate danger, and the lack of wind that evening meant sparks weren't carrying to other buildings. Several men formed a bucket brigade from the well anyway, throwing water on the ground between the burning barn and other structures to create a wet barrier that would stop any errant flames. The fire burned through the night, gradually consuming everything combustible, until only the stone foundation and twisted metal remnants remained. As dawn approached, and the flames finally died to smoldering embers, men began the grim task of searching the ruins for Robert Thornton's body. They found him near what had been the rear door, his remains badly burned but recognizable enough to confirm his identity. The door itself had collapsed inward during the fire, its crossbar apparently failing under the heat's stress, which explained why Thornton hadn't been able to escape through that exit. Thomas Fletcher led the investigation into the fire's cause, questioning Joshua extensively about the evening's events and examining what remained of the barn's structure for clues about how the blaze had started. Joshua maintained his story consistently, explaining that he had been working in the tack room when he first noticed smoke, that the fire had already been spreading rapidly when he discovered it, that he had prioritized evacuating the valuable horses before attempting to locate Master Thornton. The overseer pressed hard on certain details, particularly why Joshua hadn't immediately searched for his master rather than focusing on the animals, but Joshua had prepared for this question. "The horses were screaming, sir," Joshua explained, keeping his eyes downcast in appropriate deference. "I could hear them panicking in their stalls, and I knew they'd die if I didn't get them out immediately. I thought Master Thornton had already left the barn, assumed he'd gone back to the main house. It wasn't until I had all the horses secured that I realized he must still be inside, and by then the fire was too fierce to enter." The explanation emphasized Joshua's devotion to the horses that everyone knew characterized his work, while also suggesting reasonable assumptions about Thornton's whereabouts that had tragically proven wrong. The investigation concluded within 3 days that Robert Thornton had died in an accidental fire of unknown origin, possibly started by a lantern he had been carrying that had either been dropped or placed too near combustible materials. The barn's rapid burning was attributed to the large quantities of dry hay stored in the loft and to the building's age, which had created structural weaknesses that allowed fire to spread efficiently through the framework. The fact that the rear door had been found barred from outside was noted but explained as Joshua having secured the building after evacuating the horses, not realizing his master was still inside. A tragic error, but an understandable one given the chaos of fighting a rapidly spreading fire. Joshua was questioned multiple times during those 3 days, his story examined for inconsistencies or evidence of deliberate action, but he maintained his account with unwavering consistency. The other enslaved workers on the plantation confirmed that Joshua had always been meticulous about fire safety, that he had repeatedly warned about the dangers of smoking or using open flames carelessly near the stored hay, that his devotion to the horses was such that evacuating them before anything else made complete sense. White neighbors who had known Joshua for years testified to his reliability and trustworthiness, several noting that the loss of the barn he had maintained for 2 decades must be devastating to him. Catherine Thornton returned from Richmond for her husband's funeral, a modest affair attended by neighboring plantation owners and local officials who paid respects to a family that had been prominent in the region for generations. She seemed more relieved than grieved by her husband's death, though she performed the expected rituals of widowhood with sufficient conviction that no one openly questioned her sincerity. In the weeks following the funeral, she made decisions about the plantation's future that would significantly impact Joshua's life and the lives of his family. Catherine had never wanted to manage a plantation, had married Robert primarily because her family's financial difficulties made the match advantageous, despite her personal reservations about her husband's character. With Robert dead and no children to consider, she chose to sell the property and return to Richmond, where she had family and social connections. The sale process would take months, but Catherine made certain decisions immediately about enslaved workers she particularly valued. Joshua, Rebecca, and Hannah were among a small group of people Catherine granted manumission papers, legally freeing them from bondage. The official explanation was that these individuals had provided such exceptional service over the years that freedom represented appropriate gratitude for their loyalty. The reality, which Catherine never stated explicitly, but which Joshua understood perfectly, was that she recognized what had likely happened in that barn and chose to reward rather than punish it. The manumission papers were drawn up by a Richmond lawyer and filed with the county clerk in November 1842, establishing Joshua Reed, Rebecca Reed, and Hannah Reed as free persons of color under Virginia law. The documents represented a transformation so profound that Joshua struggled to fully comprehend it during those first days after receiving them. He had been enslaved for 40 years, had never known what it meant to control his own movements or make decisions about his own future. Now, suddenly, he possessed legal status that white society was obligated to recognize, at least in theory, if not always in practice. Catherine Thornton offered Joshua a substantial sum, $300, as additional compensation for his years of service and for the horses he had saved during the fire. She also provided letters of reference that described his exceptional abilities as a stable master and horse trainer, documents that would prove valuable when seeking employment as a free man. These gestures confirmed Joshua's suspicion that Catherine understood more about her husband's death than she would ever acknowledge publicly, that she viewed Joshua's actions as justice served rather than crime committed. The family remained on the Thornton plantation through the winter, while Catherine finalized the property's sale, living in their cabin and helping maintain the remaining structures during the transition period. Joshua spent those months working with the horses that had survived the fire, ensuring they remained healthy and well-trained for whoever would eventually purchase them. The work provided continuity during a time of enormous change, giving him familiar tasks to perform while his mind adjusted to the reality of freedom. Other enslaved workers on the plantation treated Joshua with complex mixture of emotions during those final months. Some expressed genuine happiness about his family's liberation, viewing it as rare good fortune in a system that rarely provided such outcomes. Others showed resentment that Joshua had secured freedom while they remained in bondage, though most understood enough about what had likely happened to keep such feelings private. A few of the older workers approached Joshua quietly to ask about the fire, probing with carefully worded questions that never quite asked directly whether he had killed Robert Thornton, but made clear they suspected the truth. To these subtle inquiries, Joshua responded with studied ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying what had actually happened that October night. He would simply observe that Robert Thornton had died in a terrible accident, that fires were unpredictable and dangerous, that sometimes justice arrived through unexpected means. Those who wanted to believe in Joshua's innocence could find support for that belief in his carefully neutral responses. Those who preferred to believe he had committed calculated murder could find evidence for that interpretation as well. The ambiguity served Joshua's purposes by allowing different people to construct whatever narrative best suited their needs or beliefs. The story of Joshua Reed and the barn fire began spreading through enslaved communities across Virginia and into neighboring states, through the invisible networks that connected black workers, despite the distances and restrictions that supposedly separated them. The details transformed with each retelling, some versions claiming Joshua had called down divine fire to consume his daughter's abuser, others insisting he had used African magic passed down through generations to make flames obey his will. Still others told the story more plainly, presenting it as an example of how knowledge and planning could overcome even overwhelming power differentials when a man was pushed beyond endurance. These varying narratives served important purposes for enslaved people who heard them. They provided examples of resistance and justice in a system designed to crush both, offering hope that oppression could be challenged through intelligence and careful planning, even when direct confrontation meant certain death. The stories also conveyed practical information about how specific knowledge understanding fire construction, patterns of behavior could be transformed into weapons when circumstances required. Young people learning skilled trades heard Joshua's story and understood that the expertise they were acquiring possessed dimensions beyond simple labor, that knowledge itself was a form of power that couldn't be entirely controlled by those who claimed to own the people who possessed it. In March 1843, the Thornton plantation was sold to a buyer from North Carolina who planned to convert it from horse breeding to cotton cultivation. Catherine departed for Richmond with the proceeds from the sale, leaving behind a property that would look very different under new ownership. Joshua, Rebecca, and Hannah left Virginia shortly after the sale was finalized, traveling north along routes established by the Underground Railroad despite carrying legal papers that proved their free status. Those papers offered protection, but the family understood that free black people in the South remained vulnerable to kidnapping and fraudulent re-enslavement, making the journey north urgent despite their legal status. They settled eventually in Philadelphia, where a substantial free black community offered both economic opportunities and relative safety from the slave catchers who operated openly in border states. Joshua found work with a shipping company that maintained draft horses for moving cargo, applying his skills in a context where he received wages for expertise that had previously generated profit only for white owners. The pay was modest compared to what white horse trainers commanded, but it was more money than Joshua had ever controlled in his life, and it was his to spend as he chose. Rebecca established a small sewing business, using skills honed during years of servitude to create income that contributed significantly to the family's stability. Hannah, who had been so traumatized during that terrible September night in Virginia, gradually healed in the safety of freedom, eventually marrying a carpenter named Samuel, who treated her with the gentleness and respect she deserved. The Reed family built a life in Philadelphia that would have been impossible in Virginia, participating in the city's free black community and contributing to networks that helped other formerly enslaved people establish themselves after escaping bondage. Joshua rarely spoke about the barn fire to anyone outside his immediate family, maintaining the careful ambiguity that had served him well during the investigation. But occasionally, when talking with other men who had escaped slavery or who had negotiated freedom through various means, he would share observations about how knowledge could become power, how understanding the systems that oppressed you could reveal vulnerabilities to exploit, how patience and planning could achieve what direct confrontation never could. These conversations never quite crossed into explicit admission of murder, but they conveyed information that attentive listeners understood clearly. Before we end, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Joshua lived to age 68, dying in 1870 in the Philadelphia home he had purchased with money earned through his own labor. His funeral was attended by more than 100 people, including family members, fellow workers from the shipping company, and members of the free black community who had known him as a quiet, dignified man whose past remained partially mysterious despite decades of freedom. The eulogy praised his skill with horses and his dedication to family, making only brief reference to his years in slavery and saying nothing specific about the circumstances that had led to his liberation. But among those who attended Joshua's funeral were several people who knew the fuller story, who had heard whispered accounts of the barn fire and the master who died trapped inside while horses were saved by the man he had enslaved. These individuals understood that Joshua Reed represented something important in the history of resistance against slavery, an example of how intelligence and specialized knowledge could be transformed into weapons when circumstances demanded action that the law would never sanction. The barn that had burned so completely that October night in 1842 was never rebuilt. The new owner of the Thornton plantation focused his resources on cotton cultivation rather than horse breeding, and the stone foundation where the stable had stood gradually became overgrown with weeds and small trees. Local people would occasionally point out the ruins to visitors, telling stories about the tragic fire that had claimed Robert Thornton's life and destroyed one of Virginia's finest breeding facilities. Some of these stories mentioned the enslaved stablemaster, who had heroically saved all 12 horses, despite being unable to reach his trapped master, presenting Joshua as a loyal servant who had done everything possible under terrible circumstances. Other versions of the story, told more quietly in spaces where white listeners weren't present, suggested different interpretations of what had happened that night. These narratives spoke of deliberate planning, of a father's rage transformed into calculated action, of doors that had been barred not by accident, but by design. The details varied depending on who told the story and who listened, but the core message remained consistent. Joshua Reed had used his knowledge and position to eliminate a threat to his family in a way that appeared accidental to investigators who couldn't imagine an enslaved person capable of such sophisticated planning. The legend of Joshua Reed and the burning barn became particularly popular among enslaved people who worked in skilled positions that required specialized knowledge. Blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and others who possessed expertise beyond simple manual labor heard the story and understood its implications. The knowledge they were forced to acquire through years of labor could serve purposes beyond generating profit for their enslavers. It could become leverage for negotiating better treatment, or information to be withheld during crucial moments, or even weapons to be deployed when circumstances became unbearable. This understanding of knowledge as power influenced how enslaved craftsmen approached their work and training. They paid attention not just to the skills themselves, but to their potential applications in contexts their masters never considered. A blacksmith who understood metallurgy knew which joints could be deliberately weakened to fail under stress. A carpenter who built structures knew which supports were critical and which could be compromised without immediate detection. A stablemaster who understood animals and buildings knew exactly how to create conditions that would result in fire spreading with lethal efficiency while appearing entirely accidental. The broader historical significance of Joshua Reed's story lies in how it challenges simplified narratives about slavery and resistance. Popular understanding of resistance often focuses on dramatic escapes, armed rebellions, or overt defiance actions that were certainly important, but that represented only one dimension of how enslaved people fought against their oppression. Joshua's story illustrates a quieter but equally significant form of resistance, the strategic use of specialized knowledge to achieve outcomes that direct confrontation could never accomplish. This type of resistance required extraordinary patience and discipline, maintaining submissive behavior while planning actions that contradicted every external appearance of loyalty and acceptance. It demanded sophisticated understanding of systems and people, recognizing patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited at carefully chosen moments, and it necessitated willingness to accept enormous personal risk, understanding that any failure or discovery would result in consequences far worse than continued endurance of oppression. Joshua Reed's willingness to destroy the barn that had been his life's work demonstrates the depth of rage and determination that the assault on his daughter had created. The stable represented 20 years of labor, expertise, and achievement within the narrow confines available to enslaved people. Burning it meant destroying the only professional identity Joshua had ever known, eliminating the source of whatever status and respect he had managed to earn despite his legal status as property. The sacrifice was enormous, but Joshua made it willingly because protecting his daughter mattered more than preserving his professional legacy. The fact that Joshua secured freedom for his family through this action adds another layer of complexity to the moral calculations involved. He committed murder, which any ethical framework would recognize as a grave act, regardless of the victim's crimes or the perpetrator's motivations. But he committed that murder within a system that provided no legal recourse for enslaved people whose children were violated by their owners, a system that would have punished Joshua for any attempt to seek justice through legitimate channels while protecting Thornton from any accountability for his actions. Modern ethical frameworks struggle with these situations, where every available action involves moral compromise. Joshua could have done nothing, accepting his daughter's violation as one more horror in a system built on horror. But what parent could make that choice? He could have attempted escape, but the risks of being caught while fleeing with a wife and teenage daughter were prohibitive, and capture would have meant punishment for the entire family. He could have confronted Thornton directly, but that path led to certain death for Joshua and potentially worse consequences for Hannah and Rebecca. The option Joshua chose calculated murder, disguised as accident, violated fundamental moral principles about the sanctity of human life and the wrongness of taking life regardless of justification. But it also represented the only avenue available to a father desperate to protect his child in a system designed to make such protection impossible. The ethical ambiguity of this choice reflects the broader moral catastrophe of slavery itself, a system so fundamentally unjust that it created situations where every possible action involved some form of moral compromise. Hannah Reed, who survived into the early 20th century, occasionally spoke about her father in interviews conducted by researchers documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences. She never directly confirmed that Joshua had deliberately set the fire that killed Robert Thornton, maintaining the family's careful ambiguity about that night's events. But she spoke eloquently about her father's intelligence, his deep knowledge of horses and buildings, and his fierce devotion to family. Those who interviewed her came away with clear impression that Joshua had been far more than the simple, loyal servant that official records suggested, though the full truth of what he had done remained tantalizingly just beyond explicit statement. The physical site where the Thornton plantation once stood exists today as part of a much larger agricultural operation, the property having been subdivided and sold multiple times over the 180 years since the fire. The stone foundation where the stable barn stood has long since been removed or buried, leaving no visible trace of the structure that once housed Virginia's finest breeding horses, and that served as the setting for a father's calculated revenge. Local historians who study the region's plantation era occasionally mention the Thornton estate and the fire that killed its owner, but these references typically treat the incident as historical footnote rather than significant event worthy of deeper examination.